Why did no one look twice when she limped through the doors? The automatic glass panels slid open at precisely 800 hours, and the heat of another Southern California morning pooled against the cool, antiseptic air of Naval Hospital Camp Pendleton. Casey Monroe crossed the threshold slowly, her left leg dragging almost imperceptibly behind her right. A canvas messenger bag hung from her shoulder. Her movements were quiet, deliberate, almost unremarkable. No medals, no uniform, no indication that she was about to rewrite everything the staff inside thought they knew about courage, competence, and the silent weight of service. The sterile smell hit her like a flashback. Disinfectant, recycled air, fluorescent lights humming overhead. For anyone else, it was just a hospital. For Casey, it was memory's ambush. Forward operating bases. Field hospitals carved out of makeshift shelters. The kind of places where seconds, not minutes, separated life from death. She paused just long enough to steady her breathing, to remind herself, this was not Afghanistan. This was not Iraq. This was Camp Pendleton, and she was supposed to be safe here. Supposed to be a patient. She approached the reception desk with the careful gait of someone who had learned to walk twice in one lifetime, once as a child, once after shrapnel tore through her leg. The woman behind the counter, Linda Morrison, offered the practiced smile of someone who'd spent years navigating every type of personality that passed through a military hospital. Her badge read 15 years of service. "How can I help you today?" she asked. Casey slid a manila folder onto the counter with the same precision she once reserved for lining up surgical instruments. "Casey Monroe, I have a follow-up with Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, 8:30. Linda tapped quickly at her keyboard, eyes skimming the screen. "I see you here. The doctor's running 15 minutes behind, but we'll get you checked in." She handed Casey a clipboard. "Please take a seat and fill these out, Miss Monroe." Miss, not Captain. Not even the simple nod to a woman who'd once carried rank into places most people never saw. Just another name on a list. Casey accepted the forms wordlessly and walked to the waiting area. She, grown used to this new anonymity, the way her title disappeared the moment the uniform did. She chose a seat near the window, where civilian cars sat next to military vehicles, a silent reminder of the strange border these hospitals occupied. Neither fully civilian nor fully military, much like her. Around her, the waiting room pulsed with its usual rhythm. A young Marine in crisp blues waited for a routine deployment physical. An older man in a Vietnam vet cap murmured to his wife about hearing aids. Families shuffled in and out, each carrying their own burdens. Casey opened a paperback, The Hot Zone. It wasn't exactly light reading, but it gave her something to focus on other than the walls closing in. She tried to lose herself in the story of viral outbreaks, in medical language that felt more like home than anything outside these walls ever did. But it didn't last. "Excuse me," a voice said. A woman in scrubs, blonde hair and a ponytail stood beside her. "Olivia Wright, RN. Are you here to see Dr. Hayes too?" "Yes," Casey answered without looking up. "I couldn't help but notice you're reading The Hot Zone." Olivia's tone carried an easy, practiced friendliness. "Kind of intense for an ortho follow-up, don't you think?" There it was, the soft assumption. Patients with metal in their bones weren't supposed to be fluent in hemorrhagic fevers. Olivia smiled, well-meaning, but condescending all the same. "Some of that stuff gets graphic. Might not be the best reading if you're already dealing with medical issues." If only she knew. Casey had once stabilized a soldier while mortar rounds screamed overhead, her hands elbow-deep in a shredded abdomen, blood pooling in sand. Ebola didn't scare her. Reality did. She met Olivia's gaze evenly. "It was recommended to me," she said neutrally. "Seemed interesting." Olivia lingered, waiting for the polite back-and-forth she was used to. When it didn't come, she shrugged and moved away. Casey returned her eyes to the page, though her mind had already drifted elsewhere. "People think reading medical stuff means they can diagnose themselves," came another voice. Derek Johnson, an orderly with years of routine etched into his movements. He wiped a counter near her chair, clearly proud to offer a nugget of worldly wisdom. Usually doesn't work out that way. These doctors went to school for 8, 10 years. No shame in leaving the diagnosing to the professionals. Casey's expression didn't change. "I'm sure you're right," she said quietly. He nodded, satisfied. She didn't tell him about the years of training, the clandestine courses, the surgeries performed under gunfire. She didn't tell him that she'd taught anatomy to people who didn't have the luxury of textbooks, that she'd earned her expertise in places where doctor was whoever could keep someone alive long enough for a helicopter to arrive. Around her, conversations continued, oblivious. To them, she was just another veteran, a limp, a folder, and a quiet demeanor. When her name was called, she rose with quiet dignity and followed the nurse down the hallway. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes barely looked up from her tablet as Casey entered the exam room. "Good morning, Miss Monroe. Any changes in pain or mobility since last visit?" Casey answered clinically, efficiently. She knew this rhythm well, the checks, the palpations, the range of motion measurements. Hayes worked with professional detachment, scanning for swelling, testing degrees of flexion. 85% range of motion, she noted. Excellent progress. Then Casey reached into her messenger bag. "I've been reading some research," she began, pulling out printed studies from the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery and the American Journal of Sports Medicine, on neuromuscular electrical stimulation combined with proprioceptive training for tibial plateau reconstructions. "I'd like to discuss incorporating." Dr. Hayes looked up with a familiar expression, the polite, practiced face physicians wore when patients started talking about what they'd found online. "I appreciate your interest," she said slowly, "but I'd caution against over-reliance on medical literature without proper context. These are technical studies. Misinterpretation is common." "These are peer-reviewed," Casey countered gently, "and my baseline fitness level was significantly higher than." "Physiological healing doesn't differentiate between military and civilian," Dr. Hayes interrupted smoothly. "We're following established protocols." Dismissed, not rudely but completely. Casey closed the folder, sliding the papers back into her bag with the same quiet control she used in combat when arguing would cost precious seconds. "Of course," she said evenly. The appointment ended like any other, prescription renewed, follow-up scheduled. The doctor returned to her tablet. Casey returned to anonymity. Outside, she sat in her car for almost 20 minutes before starting the engine. The heat built inside the cabin, the steering wheel burned her palms, but that discomfort was nothing compared to the familiar weight in her chest. She'd known this would happen. She'd prepared for it. But knowing didn't soften the sting. In uniform, she'd been respected. Her knowledge had been sought after, sometimes desperately. Now, as a patient, it was dismissed as overconfidence. She drove toward the beach, not because she liked crowds, she didn't, but because the ocean was vast, and vastness had a way of putting things into perspective. She found a bench overlooking the water and opened the same folder Dr. Hayes had brushed aside. These weren't casual printouts. They were meticulously chosen, connected to techniques she'd used for years on wounded operators who didn't have the luxury of 6-month recovery timelines. Neuromuscular stimulation, accelerated rehab, methods born in necessity, refined in blood. But explaining that would require revealing who she really was, and she wasn't ready. Maybe she never would be. Classified missions, classified patients, techniques developed in facilities that officially didn't exist. She learned to live with the silence. A jogger passed by and her eyes tracked his gait automatically. Subtle pronation, left ankle compensation, early signs of lower back imbalance. In her old life, she would have called him over, offered a fix. Now, she stayed silent. Civilians didn't want unsolicited advice from strangers. They wanted experts with visible badges. She closed the folder. Her knowledge would remain hers alone, just as it had since the blast. Her phone buzzed. A text from Sandra Martinez, her physical therapist. Thursday confirmed. Sandra was different, she listened. She didn't know the full truth, but she listened. Casey typed a quick confirmation and slipped the phone back into her bag. All around her, life moved on. Families with beach towels, teenagers with speakers, couples taking pictures, ordinary lives untouched by the kind of nights that haunted her. She stood slowly, her reconstructed leg stiff from sitting. Walking was getting easier, but not fast enough. Not like before. She thought of who she'd been, Compass, the medic whose name echoed through special operations briefings, the one who didn't just save lives, she redefined what was possible. Now she was just Casey Monroe, honorably discharged, limping, reading medical journals on park benches. She didn't know it yet, but in less than 24 hours, that silence, the carefully constructed wall between who she had been and who she pretended to be, would shatter. And when it did, the people who dismissed her would see exactly what they'd overlooked. Sometimes strength doesn't announce itself. It waits, quietly, until the moment comes when silence is no longer an option. Why did the Navy corpsman stop what he was doing the moment he saw her walk through the doors? Gabriel Santos had worked the night shift at Naval Hospital Camp Pendleton for 18 months, long enough to learn how to see what others missed. The world was quieter at night, fewer voices, fewer distractions, and in that quiet you notice things, small details, tells. The way experienced surgeons moved toward a patient without wasting a single step. The way seasoned ICU nurses prioritized care during a crisis. The way combat veterans, even out of uniform, carried themselves like their surroundings were something to be mapped, not merely inhabited. So when Casey Monroe crossed the hospital threshold again the following morning, 15 minutes early for her physical therapy appointment, Gabriel noticed. It wasn't just her limp. Plenty of patients limped. It was the way she moved through space. Purposeful, economical. Her eyes didn't just glance at the directory. They swept the hospital's layout like someone mentally rehearsing evacuation routes, triage zones, fallback points. That wasn't the behavior of a patient. That was the instinct of someone trained to lead in chaos. He'd overheard snippets of conversation the day before. Dr. Hayes's casual dismissal of her research, Olivia's light teasing, Derek's lectures about leaving medicine to the professionals. It had been routine, background noise, but something about their words hadn't matched what Gabriel's instincts were telling him. She didn't fit the pattern. During his lunch break, curiosity turned into action. He walked down to medical records and requested Casey Monroe's file. As a hospital corpsman assigned to the orthopedic department, he had legitimate clearance. The clerk barely glanced up before handing him the folder. He flipped it open. It was sparse, too sparse. Basic demographics, surgical notes on her leg reconstruction, physical therapy progress reports, insurance documentation, but no service history, no MOS, no deployment logs, no incident report describing how the injuries had occurred, just the sanitized phrase combat-related trauma. Gabriel frowned. Injuries like hers didn't happen on routine deployments. They came from catastrophic events, improvised explosive devices, catastrophic air assaults, operations deep enough that medevac wasn't a guarantee. And in military records, injuries like that were usually accompanied by pages of operational documentation. The absence of that data wasn't an oversight. It was a wall. He'd seen it before during rotations at facilities that treated special operations personnel. Records scrubbed clean of anything that might hint at missions that didn't officially exist. She wasn't just some veteran. She was someone protected by layers of classification. He closed the file slowly, his mind spinning through possibilities. 18D, flight medic, surgical team attached to Tier 1. The next morning, he arrived 30 minutes before his shift started and stationed himself by the main entrance, not to follow her, but to observe again. He needed to know if his instincts had misfired. They hadn't. Casey entered at 08:15 sharp, exactly like the day before. She paused briefly at the information desk to confirm her route to physical therapy. Her eyes tracked movement in the hallway, subtle but precise, like someone assessing choke points, exits, and potential threats out of ingrained habit. Then came the siren. It was faint at first, carried through the corridors by the open emergency department doors. Most people barely noticed it. Casey stopped, turned her head, listened. Her posture shifted imperceptibly, not fear, not confusion, but calculation. Her body recognized the sound before her mind gave permission. Gabriel's suspicions hardened into certainty. She'd been there before. Sandra Martinez, her physical therapist, was updating patient charts when Gabriel knocked on the office door. Sandra got a minute. She looked up smiling. "Of course, what's up?" "I wanted to ask about one of your patients, Casey Monroe." Sandra's brows rose. "Casey, why?" "She stood out to me. Has she ever mentioned her background? Military, medical training, anything?" Sandra leaned back thoughtfully. "Not specifically. She's private. But she's one of the most engaged patients I've ever had. She doesn't just do the exercises, she analyzes them. Asks about muscle recruitment patterns, proprioceptive feedback, integrated functional movement. Honestly, sometimes it feels like I'm working with a colleague, not a patient." "What kind of questions?" "Last week she suggested modifying her routine to avoid compensatory movement patterns. Most patients don't even know what that means." Gabriel nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." Sandra tilted her head. "Why the sudden interest?" Gabriel hesitated. "I checked her file. It's unusually thin. No service history. Nothing about how the injury happened. It looks sanitized, like classified sanitized." Sandra's eyes narrowed. "You think she's special operations?" "I don't know, but she moves like someone who's been through advanced medical training, and she notices things other people don't." Sandra was quiet for a moment, weighing his words. "You might be right. She never corrects anyone when they underestimate her. She just listens. That kind of patience, it's practiced." Before Gabriel could respond, the calm but urgent voice of the hospital's PA system cut through the hallway. "Code Silver, Emergency Department. Code Silver, Emergency Department. All available medical personnel respond immediately." Their eyes met. Code Silver meant one thing: mass casualty. The emergency department transformed in seconds. Controlled chaos. Nurses at triage stations rattling through checklists. Stretchers lined up as the first ambulances arrived. Doctors moving like chess pieces under invisible pressure. The initial reports were grim. A tour bus full of retired veterans had collided with a commercial truck on I-5. 32 passengers, at least 15 critical. Gabriel sprinted toward the trauma bays. Sandra peeled off toward physical therapy to coordinate patient evacuations. Over the PA, bed assignments were called out like battlefield coordinates. Casey was halfway through a parallel bar exercise when she heard the alert. For a moment she stood still, the sound rooting her in place. Her fingers tightened around the bar. Her pulse quickened, not with fear but with recognition. Then her training took over. The exercises forgotten, she walked toward the emergency wing, her reconstructed leg moving with determination. She told herself she was just curious, that it was natural to want to know what was happening. But deep down she already knew the truth. Curiosity didn't make her hands tremble like this. Muscle memory did. The closer she got, the clearer the sounds became. Gurneys rattling, voices snapping orders, the rising tempo of a hospital pushed to its limits. She reached the edge of the trauma bays and stopped, just outside the controlled frenzy, letting her eyes sweep the room the way they had hundreds of times before. Multiple orthopedic traumas, at least 2 TBI candidates, internal bleeds waiting on imaging, a bottleneck at CT, a shortage of available trauma surgeons. She saw it all in seconds. Gabriel saw her too. She wasn't the quiet woman from the waiting room anymore. Her posture had shifted, shoulders squared, eyes sharp, focused. The kind of focus you only saw in people who'd stood in chaos before and learned to shape it. He approached cautiously. "Casey, are you all right?" She turned toward him, and the look in her eyes answered everything. "How many critical?" she asked, her voice suddenly firm, clipped, unmistakably professional. 715 total. Anesthesiology coverage. 2 on duty, 1 in surgery already. She nodded, calculating. Her questions weren't idle curiosity, they were operational. Gabriel took a breath. "What's your medical background?" Her jaw tightened. For a moment she hesitated, caught between the privacy she'd fought to maintain and the crisis unfolding before her. Then she made a decision. Army Special Forces medic, 18 Delta, 6 deployments, 3 years trauma team leader, forward surgical team, Afghanistan. Gabriel's breath caught. 18 Delta, the elite of the elite. The medics embedded with special operations units, trained to a level most civilian physicians never touched. He'd studied their case reports in training, legendary scenarios that blurred the line between medicine and miracle. "Your call sign?" he asked quietly. She met his eyes. "Compass." It hit him like a blow. He'd heard that name during advanced combat medic training. Compass, the medic whose field techniques had become required study. The one who'd stabilized an entire Ranger element under fire at Firebase Charlie. "Jesus," he whispered, "you're her." She didn't flinch. "Right now, the patient on Gurney 3 has a tension pneumothorax, tracheal deviation, dropping sats. If you don't decompress his chest in the next 5 minutes, you're going to lose him." Gabriel turned toward Gurney 3. She was right. Somehow, she'd spotted it from across the room. "I'll get Dr. Hayes," he said. As he sprinted toward the trauma bays, he threw one last glance over his shoulder. Compass wasn't gone, she'd just been quiet, waiting. And the moment to break her silence had finally arrived. Why did Dr. Hayes freeze when Gabriel spoke her name? The trauma bay pulsed like a battlefield, fast, loud, organized but strained. Alarms bleated. Orders echoed. Gurneys rattled into rooms that were already full. And through that blur of motion, Gabriel pushed his way to Trauma Bay 2, where Dr. Elizabeth Hayes was bent over a patient with multiple fractures, her voice steady and commanding as she directed her team. "Doctor," Gabriel called out over the noise, urgency threading his voice. She didn't look up. "Gabriel, not now. I need blood work stat and—" "She's not who we thought she was," he cut in. That stopped her. She glanced up, irritation sharp until she saw his face. He wasn't nervous, he was certain. "Casey Monroe," he said. 18 Delta, Special Forces medic, call sign Compass. The change was instantaneous. Every physician in the Navy's medical system knew the 18DS. Special Forces medics trained in trauma, surgery, emergency medicine. The ones who worked where helicopters didn't always come, and surgical suites were whatever they could carry. And Compass, that name had circulated through whispered case studies and training modules like a legend. The medic who performed emergency thoracic surgery under fire. The one whose casualty survival rates had rewritten doctrine. Dr. Hayes's heart kicked once hard. She looked toward Gurney 3. Gabriel's words replayed in her head, tension pneumothorax, missed, 5 minutes. She strode through the trauma bay. The patient on Gurney 3 lay pale, struggling to breathe, his trachea deviating slightly left. His oxygen saturation numbers were falling fast. She didn't need a stethoscope to know Casey's assessment was right. "Needle decompression kit," she ordered. The team jumped into motion. Within seconds she had a 14-gauge catheter in her hand. She slid it into the second intercostal space, midclavicular line textbook. A hiss of trapped air escaped. The patient's chest rose more evenly. His oxygen levels began to climb. Color crept back into his face. She exhaled once, Controlled, it had been close. How did she spot that from across the room? She asked Gabriel, almost to herself. She's compass, he said simply. Dr. Hayes turned toward the far end of the trauma bay, where Casey stood with the stillness of someone trained to see everything, not interfering, just watching. And behind those calm eyes was the unmistakable intensity of someone who'd already triaged the entire room in seconds. Hayes crossed to her quickly. "Ms. Moan," she stopped mid-word. "Casey." "Doctor," Casey replied evenly. Her voice was calm, her posture alert. "You were right about Gurney 3. "I've seen it before," Casey said quietly. No bravado, no arrogance, just fact. "How many times?" Hayes asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Casey's gaze didn't waver, enough to recognize it instantly. Hayes hesitated. Just 24 hours earlier, she dismissed this woman as a well-meaning patient dabbling in medical journals. Now she was staring at someone whose diagnostic instincts were sharper than most trauma fellows. "Casey," Hayes said finally, "we need help." Casey's eyes shifted to the controlled chaos around them. "What's your surgical capacity?" 2 ORs active, 1 anesthesiologist already tied up, another covering trauma cases, 3rd en route ETA 45 minutes. "How many critical ortho cases?" 4 so far, 2 likely surgical, 1 compartment syndrome developing. Casey's gaze locked on bed 7. The man in bed 7 is your compartment syndrome, pain disproportionate to the visible injury, early tissue swelling. You've got less than an hour before irreversible damage. Hayes followed her line of sight. She saw it too now, the subtle signs she'd missed in the chaos. Casey hadn't even touched the patient. She diagnosed it from across the room. "Prep him for surgery," Hayes ordered, then turned back to Casey. "Would you consider scrubbing in?" For a heartbeat, silence hung between them. Casey hadn't been inside an operating room since the day she was pulled from Afghanistan. She hadn't held a scalpel since before the blast shattered her leg. Months of physical therapy had retrained her body, but the part of her that belonged in a trauma suite had been locked away. "I'm not licensed in California," she said carefully. "We're operating under emergency protocols," Hayes replied. "Your military credentials give you temporary authorization. The question isn't legal, it's personal." The words landed like a challenge. Casey looked around the trauma bay, monitors beeping, stretchers moving, nurses calling out vitals, patients who would live or die depending on how fast and how well these teams worked. She felt the weight settle across her shoulders, not crushing but familiar. She nodded once. "I'll need to review the surgical priorities and have someone assist who can adapt to field techniques." Relief flickered through Hayes's eyes. "Gabriel, prep OR3 for fasciotomy, and get Ruby Patel. She's been begging for trauma exposure. She's about to get more than she imagined." The surgical scrub room smelled like chlorhexidine and memory. Casey approached the sink with the same meticulous rhythm that had once defined her life. Sleeves up, hands at precise angles, scrubbing from fingertips to elbows. Dr. Hayes stood beside her, glancing over with a mixture of professional curiosity and personal reckoning. "Have you done many fasciotomies?" Hayes asked. Casey didn't look up, "More than I'd like to remember." She thought of blast injuries, delayed evacuations, young soldiers staring at her with wide eyes, whispering, "Don't let them take my leg," as she made incisions in conditions civilian surgeons would call unacceptable. They entered OR3. Ruby Patel, a medical student, stood at the side of the table, wide-eyed, breath shallow. The patient's leg was swollen tight, pale from pressure. The monitors ticked steady but strained. Casey stepped up to the table and her entire demeanor shifted. The quiet woman from the waiting room was gone. This was Compass, precise, calm, commanding. "Ruby," she said softly, "you're about to see techniques they don't teach in medical school. Field methods. Watch closely." She palpated the leg. Her fingers moved like instruments, reading the tissue tension with tactile certainty. "Pressure?" she asked. 38 millimeters of mercury, Ruby replied. Casey nodded. "We're well into danger, four-compartment fasciotomy, battlefield sequence." The scalpel touched skin. Her incisions were clean, efficient, and strategically placed, not just to relieve pressure, but to preserve future function. She moved like someone who'd done this hundreds of times under worse conditions, with fewer tools. Her hands didn't tremble. Her breathing stayed steady. Dr. Hayes watched from across the table, narrating quietly for Ruby even as her own eyes followed every move with professional awe. "See how she sequences the releases. That, designed to maximize decompression while minimizing bleeding." Casey worked by feel as much as sight. In field hospitals, lighting failed, power cut out. You learned to trust your hands. One compartment after another, tissue swelled and flushed with restored blood flow. The monitors responded. The patient's vitals stabilized. 18 minutes, Ruby whispered, glancing at the clock as Casey finished the closure. Civilian fasciotomies usually took 45. Casey stripped off her gloves with quiet precision. The OR staff stared not at her but at the work. The swelling had receded, circulation restored. The leg was saved. Hayes exhaled slowly. "That was extraordinary." Casey shrugged lightly. "Field techniques are designed to work under the worst conditions. In a hospital, they're even more effective." And just like that, the silence surrounding her broke. Whispers started in the hallway. A name passed from nurse to doctor to intern: Compass. The quiet woman they'd underestimated had just shown them what real expertise looked like. She didn't grandstand. She didn't linger. She handed off post-op instructions with clinical calm and stepped back into the corridor. But the way people looked at her now had changed. She'd spent months living in silence. In less than an hour, she'd reminded an entire hospital who she really was. And the ripples were only beginning. Why did the young medical student follow her down the hallway, as if she were chasing a ghost? The OR doors swung shut behind Casey with a muted thud, sealing away the adrenaline of the fasciotomy. The hallway outside was quieter, but only just. Monitors beeped in nearby rooms. Stretchers passed like whispers. The hospital moved in a rhythm now, smoother, sharper. Word had already spread. Ruby Patel hurried to catch up, her surgical cap slightly askew, eyes wide with the stunned brightness of someone who just witnessed something they didn't entirely understand. "Casey," she called, almost tripping over her own scrub shoes. Casey turned, still adjusting the strap of her bag. Her face was calm again, the battle focus sliding away like a visor lifted after the mission ends. I mean, ma'am," Ruby stammered, then shook her head. "What you did in there, I've never seen anything like it. The way you palpated before cutting, the compartment sequence. You didn't even need pressure monitors, you just knew." Casey's eyes softened, but her voice stayed measured. "That's because sometimes you don't get monitors, or power, or time." Ruby swallowed. "Were you special operations?" The question hung between them like a drawn breath. Ruby had heard the whispers outside the OR. Compass. It sounded like a myth. But now, standing face to face, she understood that myths had faces. Casey didn't confirm or deny. "I did my job," she said simply. Ruby wanted to ask more, to understand the story behind the silence, but a nurse's voice cut through the hallway. "Bay 5 needs a physician. Orthopedic consult now." Before Ruby could react, Casey was already moving, that same quiet, commanding stride carrying her toward the call. Ruby followed without hesitation. Bay 5 held a man in his 70s, pale and trembling, his leg pinned awkwardly beneath temporary splints. A nurse read out vitals. BP 94/60, HR 112, distal pulses weak. Dr. Hayes arrived seconds later, scanning the chart. Open tib-fib fracture, significant blood loss. He needs stabilization before OR. Casey stood just behind the team, observing, not leading, not officially, but her presence shifted the energy. Hayes caught her eye. Suggestions. Casey didn't hesitate. He's bleeding into the compartments. Direct traction will worsen it. Use a modified field splint with padded stabilization. Elevate 15 degrees. Start warmed fluids, not room temp. He's hypovolemic and vasoconstricted. Hayes turned to the nurse. Do it. Ruby watched, wide-eyed, as every instruction Casey gave was executed without question. Hayes didn't challenge. She collaborated. Within minutes, the patient's vitals stabilized enough to transfer to the OR. Hayes exhaled. Compass, how would you like to assist on this one? Casey froze. The name spoken out loud in that tone cut through her carefully maintained anonymity. Around the bay, nurses glanced up. Ruby caught her breath. It wasn't a rumor anymore. It was acknowledgement. She met Hayes's eyes. You sure? Hayes nodded. I've read about you. Some of us learned your techniques in training modules. If you're willing to step in, we could use you. There was no bravado in her tone, only respect. Casey inhaled slowly. She hadn't scrubbed into 2 back-to-back surgeries since before the blast. Her reconstructed leg ached from the fasciotomy. Fatigue crept at the edges, but beneath it was something she hadn't felt in months: purpose. I'll assist, she said. In OR2, the lights were brighter, the team larger. Casey stood across from Hayes this time, Ruby at her side. The older man lay anesthetized, his leg a twisted wreck of bone and torn flesh. It reminded her of a Humvee rollover she once worked outside Kandahar, different landscape, same fracture pattern. Hayes began the reduction, her movements skilled but deliberate. Casey observed, silent at first. Then, angle your traction 5 degrees medial, his proximal fragments overriding. Hayes adjusted. The bones aligned cleanly on the fluoroscope. Ruby whispered, how did you see that? Casey's voice stayed low. Patterns. After a while, they don't surprise you anymore. As the procedure continued, she guided, not commanding but offering insights at critical moments. Clamp higher. That vessel retracts fast. / padding here will prevent post-op compartment syndrome. Check perineal nerve before closure. Every suggestion tightened the procedure like well-oiled gears meshing. Hayes didn't bristle. She absorbed. The OR staff followed Casey's quiet authority instinctively, the way soldiers follow the one person who doesn't flinch under fire. 90 minutes later, the surgery ended cleanly. The fracture was stabilized, circulation preserved. When they stepped into the scrub room afterward, Hayes leaned against the counter, pulling off her gloves. You haven't lost a step. Casey stared at her hands under the running water. The sound reminded her of another sink, another time, where blood wasn't so easily washed away. I lost a lot, she said quietly. Hayes didn't push. She recognized the edge in that voice, the place where memory still burned. You saved his leg. Casey nodded once. We saved his leg. Later that evening, long after most of the trauma had been stabilized and the chaos settled into a heavy hospital silence, Casey found herself alone in the staff lounge. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly. A vending machine hummed in the corner. She sat at the table with her reconstructed legs stretched out, a cup of black coffee cooling between her palms. Ruby appeared hesitantly in the doorway, still in scrubs. I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to thank you for letting me watch, for teaching. Casey looked up, surprised. She spent her entire career in places where teaching happened through necessity, not thanks. You watch because you cared, Casey said. That's how it starts. Ruby stepped in. When you were working, it felt like the whole room changed, like everyone just followed your lead. Casey's gaze drifted to the floor. In the field, if they don't, people die. Ruby sat across from her, curiosity tempered by respect. Why did you stop? Casey's fingers tightened around the coffee cup. She'd been asked versions of that question by therapists, doctors, officers. But from Ruby, it wasn't administrative curiosity. It was human. "I didn't stop," she said finally. "My body did. The blast took more than bone, it took certainty. And without that, you don't lead teams anymore. You become a patient." Ruby didn't speak, she just listened. And for the first time in months, Casey didn't feel like her silence was a barrier. It felt understood. As she left the hospital that night, the air was cool, the stars faint above the parking lot. She paused by her car, leaning on the door, leg aching from the day's work. She'd come in for physical therapy. She was leaving having changed the entire rhythm of a trauma ward. But inside, the battle she fought wasn't with scalpels or sutures. It was with memory, with identity, with the question she'd avoided for months. Was she still Compass or just Casey Monroe, a veteran with a limp and too many ghosts? She didn't have the answer yet. But for the first time, she wanted to find it. Why did the colonel walk into the hospital unannounced, asking for Compass by name? The next morning broke gray and heavy, the kind of coastal fog that clings to everything. Camp Pendleton woke slowly beneath its blanket of mist, but inside the hospital the atmosphere was anything but slow. Something was shifting. It began with whispers in the hallway. Nurses at the front desk leaned toward each other, murmuring. A radiology tech poked his head out of the imaging suite to watch two men in service dress blues stride down the corridor, their steps crisp, their expressions unreadable. They weren't patients. They weren't here for routine admin. These were officers, one Navy, one Army, moving with the kind of coordinated purpose that said command, not consultation. And between them walked a tall, broad-shouldered man with close-cropped gray hair and a uniform bristling with ribbons and tabs. His name tag read, Call R. Harlan. He didn't stop at reception. He didn't ask for directions. He knew exactly where he was going. "Where, Compass?" he asked the first nurse he saw, not Casey Monroe, not the patient with the leg injury, Compass. The word spread like a shockwave. Doctors trading reports in the hallway stopped mid-sentence. A surgical tech froze with a tray in her hands. Gabriel, just clocking in, caught the words as they echoed down the corridor, and his stomach flipped. They knew. Casey was in the rehab wing, midway through resistance band exercises, when she saw the officers through the glass wall. Her hands faltered on the band for the first time in weeks. Colonel Harlan. She hadn't seen him since the day she was medevaced out of Afghanistan, pale and half-conscious, refusing morphine until every one of her men had been accounted for. He'd been her then, a hard, deliberate man who didn't waste praise. But when he did speak it, it mattered. "Ma'am," Sandra whispered from beside her, eyes wide. "Are those?" "Yes," Casey said softly. The door opened. Harlan entered like a storm wrapped in pressed fabric, his gaze locked on her immediately, not with pity, with recognition. "Compass," he said, voice low but carrying. For a moment, the rehab gym vanished. She was back in the dust and heat of Fob Sentinel, hearing his voice over the roar of medevac rotors. She straightened slowly, the band slipping from her hands. "Sir." He stepped closer. "I didn't believe the reports, but then again, you've always had a way of surprising people." She swallowed. "What are you doing here?" "I heard what happened yesterday," he said. "2 surgeries, trauma stabilization, field techniques executed flawlessly. Word traveled fast, faster than I expected. You didn't just walk back into the fight, Compass. You turned this place upside down." "I was in the right place at the right time," she replied evenly. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You were you, that's what happened." The other officers stayed near the doorway silent. Harlan's presence filled the space. "We need to talk, somewhere private." Sandra gave Casey a questioning look. Casey nodded once, handing her the resistance bands. "Cover for me." They found an empty conference room 2 floors up. Morning light bled through the fogged windows, turning the room into a pale, quiet chamber. Harlan stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back. Casey leaned against the edge of the table, her legs stiff. "You know why I'm here," he began. "I can guess," she replied. He turned. "Task Force Delta is reconstituting. New operational theater, humanitarian and stabilization missions, high-casualty environments, limited infrastructure. We need medics who have been there, who can improvise under pressure, who can lead. And frankly, Compass, there's no one like you." The air seemed to thicken between them. "I'm out," she said quietly. "You know that." "On paper, yes, but we're not talking about conventional deployment. We're building a training cadre, medical combat doctrine for new theaters. We need someone to shape it. You've already done it in practice. Now we want you to do it officially." Her pulse quickened. For months, she'd fought to convince herself she belonged in civilian life, that her days of deployments and dust and trauma wards were behind her. But hearing him say it, "We need you," hit something deep. "I'm not who I was," she said finally. Harlan's gaze softened just barely. "None of us are, but your mind, your instincts, those haven't gone anywhere. Yesterday proved that. You can keep pretending you're just a patient, or you can accept the truth. The fight isn't done with you yet." She stared at the table, jaw tight. "Sir, the blast changed everything. I almost didn't make it, you know that." "I know," he said. "And I also know you saved 3 men before they pulled you out. You gave orders while half-conscious. That's not something you turn off." The silence that followed was heavy, not uncomfortable, just real. Finally, she said, "You're asking me to step back into something I barely survived." "I'm asking you to teach others how to survive," he countered. Her chest tightened. That was the hook, and he knew it. Teaching wasn't the same as deploying, but it wasn't walking away either. It was stepping back into the storm, not as a soldier, but as a guide. Downstairs, Gabriel and Ruby lingered outside the rehab wing, trading uneasy glances. "Who is that guy?" Ruby whispered. "Task Force Delta," Gabriel murmured. "Top brass, he's here for her." Ruby folded her arms, trying to process it all. "I knew she was incredible, but this, it's like she's part of something bigger than anyone realizes." "She is," Gabriel said softly. Back in the conference room, Harlan set a folder on the table. Inside were documents, non-disclosure agreements, program outlines, clearance forms. "I'm not asking for an answer now," he said. "But read it, think about it. You've earned the right to choose. Just remember, the world still needs people like you, whether you believe it or not." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Compass, I've commanded hundreds of soldiers. Only a handful have changed the way we fight. You're one of them." And then he was gone. Casey stared at the folder for a long time. Her reflection ghosted faintly in the conference room window. The fog outside was lifting. Inside her, something else was stirring. She built her silence like armor, but now the world was knocking, not with pity but with purpose. And for the first time since the blast, she didn't immediately turn away. Why did she linger in the parking lot long after the colonel's car disappeared into the fog? The folder sat heavy in her lap, its manila edges damp from the marine layer that settled over Camp Pendleton like a held breath. Colonel Harlan's words replayed in her mind in quiet, deliberate fragments. "We need you. The fight isn't done with you yet. Teach others how to survive." The thought dug beneath the layers of stillness she'd built. It stirred places she'd buried. She leaned back against the hood of her car, the metal cool through her jacket, and watched the distant line of the highway blur in the gray. She'd stared down RPGs, exsanguinating wounds, and the grinding uncertainty of combat zones, but nothing felt as disorienting as this moment. For months her identity had been simple, patient, veteran, survivor, a woman rebuilding what the blast had broken. But Harlan had held up a mirror, and in it she didn't see the woman limping down hospital corridors. She saw Compass, the medic who had once stood between chaos and oblivion and held the line. Her phone buzzed softly, a text from Ruby. "You were incredible yesterday. If you're around later, would you mind showing me that field compartment release technique again? I've been reading about it all morning." A second buzz, Gabriel this time. "The team hasn't stopped talking about what you did. Hayes wants to know if you'd consult on a training module next week. No pressure." She stared at the messages. No pressure. And yet the quiet pull in their words was undeniable. She closed her eyes and inhaled the salt-thick air. Part of her wanted to drive away, to shut the folder, shove it in a drawer, and convince herself this wasn't her fight anymore. But another part, the part that still reacted instinctively to a code silver, that could diagnose a tension pneumothorax from across a room, whispered a truth she wasn't ready to say aloud. You were never just a patient. By late afternoon, she found herself walking the hospital corridors again, not as a patient reporting for therapy, but as a woman taking in familiar terrain with new eyes. She passed the trauma bay where it had all begun 2 days earlier. The stretchers were neatly lined up now, monitors silent, floors gleaming. But in her mind, the room was alive again. Alarms blaring, staff moving, lives on the line. She paused outside or3, peering through the observation window. A routine procedure was underway. Civilian surgeons measured pace. She traced the ghost of her own movement in that room, where she'd cut into swollen muscle and brought back circulation in 18 minutes flat. Ruby's voice pulled her back. "I was hoping I'd find you here." The young medical student stood in scrubs again, holding a dog-eared surgical handbook and a notebook covered in frenetic handwriting. Her expression was equal parts nerves and determination. "I know you're probably busy," Ruby said quickly, "but Dr. Hayes is letting me stay late to practice surgical techniques on the training models. I was wondering if, maybe, you'd show me how you palpated for compartment syndrome, the way you felt it." Casey blinked, caught off guard by the earnestness. She'd spent years surrounded by hardened operators, not wide-eyed students looking at her like she was living history. But Ruby didn't flinch under her gaze. She held the notebook out like an offering. Casey exhaled softly. "All right, let's see what you've got." The training lab was quiet, lit by overhead fluorescents and the faint hum of ventilation. Anatomical models lined the counters. Ruby stood beside one, sleeves rolled up, notebook open. Casey picked up a model leg. "Compartment syndrome isn't just numbers," she began. "Pressure monitors can tell you what you already suspect, but in the field you often don't have that luxury. You use your hands. Tissue density, swelling, resistance. It all speaks if you know how to listen." She placed Ruby's hands on the model, guided her fingers along the fascial planes. "Here, feel that firmness. Normal compartments are soft, malleable. When pressure builds, they lose that give. It's like pressing against a water balloon inside a too tight sleeve." Ruby followed her lead, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I think I feel it," she whispered. "You'll doubt yourself at first," Casey said quietly. "Everyone does. But in the field, doubt costs limbs, sometimes lives. So you learn to trust what your hands tell you, even when everything around you is screaming chaos." Ruby looked up. "That's what you did, isn't it, in Afghanistan?" Casey's hands stilled. Memories surged unbidden. The blast, the dust, the young soldier's legs swelling fast as she worked against the clock. "Yes," she said finally, "and in places worse than that." For a moment, silence filled the lab, not awkward but reverent. Ruby wasn't just learning technique. She was learning the gravity behind it. Later, in the cafeteria, Casey found herself sitting across from Dr. Hayes. The surgeon had a coffee in hand, dark circles under her eyes from another long shift. "You've been busy," Hayes said, nodding toward the training lab. "Ruby's hungry to learn," Casey replied. Hayes studied her for a moment. "So are the rest of us." Casey frowned. "I've read your after-action reports," Hayes continued. "The declassified portions, at least. The techniques you developed in the field saved lives, dozens, maybe hundreds. And yesterday you reminded everyone here what that looks like in real time. She leaned forward. You belong in medicine, Casey, not as a patient, as a force. Casey shifted uncomfortably. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. Maybe not all at once, Hayes conceded. But don't underestimate what happened here. The staff saw you, really saw you, and that matters. That night back at her small rental near Oceanside, Casey spread the folder Harlan had given her across the kitchen table. The house was silent except for the distant rush of the Pacific. She read each page slowly. Program outlines, training doctrines, classified annexes. Her clearance would automatically reactivate if she accepted. Her hand hovered over the pen. She thought of the blast, the sound, the weight on her chest, the moment she'd believed she might die. She thought of Ruby's eager hands, Gabriel's quiet respect, Hayes's acknowledgement. She thought of the man on Gurney 3, alive because she'd spoken up. And then, beneath it all, she thought of the soldier whose leg she'd once saved in the middle of nowhere, whispering, "Don't let them take it," while she worked against the clock. Her fingers tightened around the pen. Out in the darkness, the fog had burned away. The sky was clear, scattered with stars. Inside, something in her was shifting too. For the first time since the blast, the question was, can I go back? It was how. The silence that had defined her for months wasn't breaking in one dramatic moment. It was cracking, slowly, like ice thawing after a long winter. And through those cracks, purpose was seeping back in. Why did the sound of helicopter blades overhead make her stop mid-step, heart pounding like it was years ago in another country? The next morning dawned crisp, the fog burned away early by a rare, clear sun. Casey walked across the parking lot toward the hospital's main entrance, folder tucked beneath her arm, her gait steady but thoughtful. She spent most of the night turning pages, staring at Harlan's offer as if the answer might materialize between the lines. The thumping sound started faintly, a low rhythmic chop against the quiet morning sky. Her breath caught. Without thinking, she turned her head toward the horizon. Two Navy medevac Black Hawks cut across the coastal sky, banking toward the hospital's helipad. Sunlight flashed off their rotors. For a moment, just a moment, the parking lot disappeared. She was back in Afghanistan, dust swirling, rotors beating against the night, a stretcher bumping against uneven ground, her hands slick with blood as she counted compressions out loud. She stopped walking, hand tightening on the folder. The echo of those days didn't hit her like a memory, it hit like muscle memory. Her body remembered before her mind could intervene. Then she exhaled slowly and forced herself forward. Inside, the hospital was already buzzing. A training exercise had been announced the night before, a full-scale mass casualty simulation. Every department would participate. For most, it was just another drill. For Casey, it was something else entirely. She didn't wear a uniform. She didn't need to. Her quiet presence over the last 3 days had changed how people saw her. Nurses nodded with recognition. Doctors greeted her not as a patient, but as a peer. Even the corpsman straightened unconsciously when she passed. Gabriel intercepted her near the nurse's station, a grin tugging at his usually composed face. "Morning, Compass." She shot him a warning look. "Don't." He lifted his hands. "Okay, Casey, but you're on everyone's radar now. Hayes wants you in the command center for the drill. She says your field perspective will keep them honest." She raised an eyebrow. Did she now? Gabriel shrugged. "She's not wrong." The command center was a converted conference room overlooking the ambulance bay. Whiteboards covered the walls. Radios crackled. Tactical maps and patient flow charts covered tables. Dr. Hayes stood at the front, briefing department heads. "Today's scenario is a multiple vehicle rollover on the 5:30 simulated casualties. We'll be stress testing triage, surgical throughput, and interdepartmental communication. Treat this like the real thing. When the hellos touch down, it starts. When Casey entered, heads turned, not in curiosity anymore, but in acknowledgement. Hayes gave a subtle nod and gestured her toward the triage operations table. "We could use your eyes," Hayes said. "If something looks off, speak up." Casey scanned the setup, flow diagrams, transport designations, or capacity tracking. It was clean, the kind of clean that only existed before chaos hit. "Where are your choke points?" Casey asked quietly. The room paused. She pointed to the CT corridor. "You'll bottleneck here within 15 minutes if more than 2 criticals arrive simultaneously. You need a secondary imaging protocol, and your blood bank runners will get trapped between triage and OR if you don't stagger transport intervals." A trauma fellow frowned. "We've never had that issue in drills." "Because you've never simulated 30 casualties with simultaneous helo arrival," Casey replied calmly. "You will today." The fellow opened his mouth, then closed it again when Hayes simply said, "She's right. Adjust the flow." The first Black Hawk touched down. The radios came alive. "Transport inbound. 5 critical, 3 urgent, 2 walking wounded." The exercise began. Within minutes, stretchers filled the triage bays. The room transformed, voices rising, alarms sounding. It wasn't real blood this time, but the choreography was close enough. And Casey saw what others, she felt it. She moved through the triage zone with quiet precision, spotting gaps before they widened. "Move this gurney 3 feet left. Your evac corridor's about to clog. Switch this patient's wristband to urgent. His vitals are stable. Tell CT to prep for dual scan rotation now, not later." She wasn't commanding. She was guiding, subtle adjustments that made the entire machine run smoother. Gabriel watched from the periphery, shaking his head in quiet awe. "She's doing it again," he muttered. Ruby, standing beside him with a clipboard, whispered, "She's leading without leading." Half an hour in, the drill threw its planned curveball, a communications failure between triage and OR. Hayes played it out to test adaptability. Most teams faltered in these scenarios. Confusion spread, timelines slipped. Casey saw the ripple before anyone else. She moved toward the triage coordinator, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Switch to runner relay. I'll anchor here. You dispatch physically. No waiting on radio confirmation." He hesitated. "That's not protocol." "It is in the field," she said simply. Something in her tone cut through the uncertainty. He nodded. Within minutes, the backlog cleared. ORs prepped in sequence. The entire command center adapted around her suggestion as if it had always been part of the plan. When the final patient was delivered and the simulation timer stopped, Hayes stood at the front of the room and looked around at the tired, sweaty faces. "That," she said, "was the cleanest mass casualty drill this hospital has ever run." Applause broke out, not polite but genuine. Casey stood off to the side, hands in her jacket pockets, the folder still tucked beneath her arm. She hadn't shouted commands. She hadn't taken a title. She'd simply stepped back into the current she knew best. And the hospital flowed around her. Afterward, outside near the ambulance bay, Hayes found her leaning against the railing, watching the Black Hawks lift off again. "You belong up there," Hayes said softly. Casey didn't answer immediately. Her eyes tracked the departing helicopters, sunlight glinting off their rotors. "I don't know," she said at last. "Belonging is complicated." Hayes folded her arms. "You're not the same as before. No one expects you to be. But what you did in there, that wasn't the past. That was now. That was you." Casey glanced down at the folder in her hands. She hadn't signed it yet, but the paper felt less heavy now. The world wasn't asking her to erase what had happened. It was asking her to decide what came next. That night she sat at her kitchen table again. This time she didn't stare at the folder in silence. She opened it. She read the offer not as someone trying to escape a past, but as someone considering a future. Her pen hovered over the signature line. Outside, the sound of distant helicopters echoed faintly over the coast. Inside, her pulse steadied, not with fear, but with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Readiness. Why did her hand stop trembling the moment the ink touched the page? The kitchen was quiet, washed in the silver blue of pre-dawn light. Casey sat at the same table where for nights she'd stared at the folder like it was a live explosive. But now the air felt different, still, purposeful. The offer lay open before her, pen poised above the signature line. She didn't rush. She let the silence settle over her like the slow exhale before stepping into a familiar storm. Her reconstructed leg ached dully beneath the table, a reminder of what had been taken. But in her chest, something else pulsed steady. What remained? She signed. And just like that, the trembling stopped. 3 weeks later, the hangar at Camp Pendleton buzzed with the energy of something new. Rows of stretchers, medical kits, simulated casualties, and trainees filled the cavernous space. The freshly formed Advanced Combat Medical Doctrine Program, Harlan's brainchild, had begun its inaugural class, and at the center of it stood the woman who, for months, had moved like a ghost through hospital corridors. She wore no rank, no uniform, just utility khakis, boots, and the quiet authority that no title could grant. Her hair was tied back, her posture firm. "Listen up," she said to the group of 20 trainees, combat medics, young surgeons, corpsmen, and civilian trauma fellows, assembled in a loose semicircle. "I'm not here to give you textbook answers. You'll get those from the manuals. I'm here to teach you what happens when the manuals fall apart." They leaned in. In the field, you don't get perfect lighting. You don't get full teams. You don't get unlimited time. You get chaos. And your job isn't to fight the chaos, it's to shape it. Behind her, Gabriel and Ruby stood with clipboards, assisting. Hayes watched from the back, arms folded, a faint smile tugging at her normally serious face. She had fought to bring Casey into this program, and now, watching her command a room without ever raising her voice, she knew it had been worth it. Casey gestured toward a simulated casualty on the stretcher. "This patient has a femoral bleed and tension pneumo. You have one medic, no power, limited light. What's your sequence?" Hands shot up. As the trainees fumbled through answers, Casey guided, not with condescension but with precision. She demonstrated decompression by feel, tourniquet application under pressure, improvised airway techniques using nothing but a headlamp and steady hands. The hangar transformed. Her methods were raw, sometimes unorthodox, always effective. She was teaching them not just to follow protocols but to think like survivors. Later, during a break, Harlan approached from the edge of the hangar, watching her work. "You're in your element," he said quietly. She turned toward him, the California sunlight cutting through the hangar doors behind him. "I'm finding it again." He nodded. "This program is already getting attention. Commands are asking to send their best here. They're calling it the Compass Course." She raised an eyebrow. "I didn't approve that name." He smirked. "You don't have to. Legends don't ask for permission." She shook her head, but couldn't suppress the small, unexpected laugh that slipped out, a sound that had been absent from her life for far too long. That evening, as the sun sank low over the Pacific, Casey stood on the catwalk overlooking the training grounds. Below her, trainees practiced mass casualty scenarios under fading light. Their voices blended into a hum that felt strangely familiar, like the quiet before night missions overseas. Ruby joined her, flushed from drills. "I get it now," she said breathlessly. "Why everyone talks about you the way they do. It's not just the surgeries, it's how you make people believe they can do more." Casey didn't respond immediately. She watched a young corpsman stabilize a simulated casualty, hands steady under pressure. He'd been hesitant the first day. Now his movements were clean, confident. She finally said, "Belief doesn't come from speeches. It comes from the moment someone shows you you're capable, when everything's breaking and you keep going anyway. Ruby looked at her with quiet admiration. You did that for me. Casey glanced at her, surprised. Ruby smiled softly. In the training lab that night, you didn't just teach me, you trusted me to learn. That changed everything. Casey looked back out over the training field, the ocean breeze tugging at her jacket. Her silence wasn't a wall anymore. It was a choice. Weeks turned into months. The Compass course grew. Hospitals began integrating her field protocols into their trauma drills. Combat medics left the program sharper, faster, calmer under pressure. Young doctors like Ruby carried her lessons into civilian trauma centers, bridging worlds that rarely spoke the same language. Casey's limp never fully disappeared. Some scars never do. But the way people saw her had changed, and more importantly, the way she saw herself had changed. She wasn't trying to go back to who she'd been before the blast. She was building something new from what survived. One late night, as the hangar emptied and the lights dimmed, Gabriel found her alone, rolling up stretchers. You know, he said, leaning against the wall, when I first saw you in the waiting room, I thought you were just another patient who read too much medical literature. She smirked. You weren't wrong. No, he said softly, I was blind. She paused, meeting his gaze. You showed this place what quiet strength looks like, he continued. Not by shouting, just by being you. She didn't know what to say to that, so she simply nodded. Outside, the night was cool. A helicopter passed overhead, its blades chopping softly through the dark. This time, she didn't flinch. She watched it until it faded into the horizon. Her silence wasn't the silence of withdrawal anymore. It was the silence of someone who had found her place, not in uniform, not in obscurity, but in purpose. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And somewhere, in a hospital, in a war zone, in a training hangar, someone would live because Compass had decided to stop hiding.